We're going to be going over some basics of endocrinology today. And let's just remember that endocrine glands are ductless glands throughout the body. And what we want to think about is that this gland, or group of cells, is going to manufacture and secrete a hormone that typically is going to go through the bloodstream and find a target cell. And what's going to happen is that this hormone, which is a chemical messenger, would then alter the target cell and get it to perform some function via that hormone's activation. Now, there are three major examples of hormones, and the three examples include, if we look at these cells right here, we've got these three cells in this diagram. In the first example, we're going to think about this cell up here secreting, making a hormone, and secreting it out into the interstitial fluid. So not the bloodstream in this case, but the interstitial fluid, and that there's a cell close by that will receive that hormone. And so here, sticking out of that cell, are these three receptors. Let's imagine that some of this hormone binds to these receptors, and that binding there causes a change to take place within this cell, right? So this hormone bound to that receptor will cause a change to this cell. So in this case, this is the hormone producing cell, and this one is the target cell. And the target cell ends up changing because of that hormone. Now, when we have cells close by and we don't need the bloodstream in order to cross a long distance, we call this type of secretion a paracrine type of secretion. Paracrine. And so the word para means close to, right? So these are like two neighboring cells, so they're close to each other. So para, close to, and so we don't need the bloodstream in this case, right? The bloodstream is typically for a long distance. We're not going to use it. We're just going to go with this close by interaction here using the interstitial fluid. Okay, let's look at the second type of example. So the second type of example is very similar to this one, even in terms of the word, but we call it autocrine. So whereas paracrine means close by, auto means itself. So now let's imagine that this cell is the hormone secreting cell, right? So let's just say that it makes a certain hormone, it secretes it, and then this hormone ends up actually floating and stays on that cell itself, finds receptors on the cell itself, and stimulates itself. So that type of secretion is known as an autocrine type of secretion. Let's think about what some examples could be for these two types of hormones. So in both cases, the immune system uses both of these types and is probably the most famous place where you would find these two types of hormones. So for the paracrines, I'm going to give you an example known as the prostaglandin, right? And in this case, prostaglandins are found in many places for different reasons, but here we're going to think about them as chemicals that are going to cause inflammation, right? Hormones that cause inflammation. And so the idea would be that if there is an injury, let's go back to the picture up here, right? This is our paracrine secretion. if there is an injury to this cell up here, right? Maybe you stub your toe or something like that, and then your toe has to swell up. That injury to the cells there would cause the secretion of these prostaglandins and go to neighboring cells that then would start to cause inflammation in that area as a mechanism to start repairing that area. And in fact, a lot of our drugs that are anti-inflammatory work on inhibiting these prostaglandins, right? So when you, for example, take something like Advil, right, or aspirin, right, you are taking medication that actually inhibits the formation of these prostaglandins and stops the inflammation from taking place. So that's your example for the paracrine type of secretion. For the autocrine type of secretion, for the immune system, sometimes we can think about, and even if you haven't studied this yet, you will in AMP2, is that you can think of, for example, T cells that have to be activated, right, for an immune response. And these T cells, they might get activated by basically realizing that there's a problem and having to self-stimulate themselves to possibly activate and make more of themselves in order to create an army of T cells. So for example, cell division, mitosis could happen with this self-stimulation here, causing the cell to divide, make a bigger army of T cells to then mount the attack on a certain bacterium or a certain virus that might be infecting you. So here are your two examples using the paracrines and the autocrines. Now, the most famous type of hormone is the one that goes systemic into the bloodstream and then can go very far away from the point of secretion. So let's go back to this original cell up here and think about this cell now making a hormone and secreting it into the interstitial fluid. However, right, it's going to keep going all the way until it finds the bloodstream, right, via diffusion. From higher concentration, it's going to move naturally towards the lower concentration where there is no hormone, so it'll naturally move this way, eventually to find the bloodstream. And once it's inside the bloodstream, of course, it can then go systemic, right? And it can travel to all sorts of places. And now in this case, right, the target cell can in fact be very far away from that original secreting cell. And here, very similarly, it will diffuse out of the bloodstream, go to the interstitial fluid around that target cell, and eventually find the receptors that are on that target cell and cause now this cell very far away to change based on that hormone, right? And in this case, for these types of systemic hormones, there are many examples, and these, of course, are the ones that are probably going to be the more famous ones. Real quick before I go there, I forgot to mention the name of this one, this autocrine. There are many different types of this, but let's call it the interleukin. The interleukin, right, is the type of autocrine that can stimulate T cells. And there's that prostaglandin for that paracrine, right? So these are the two types. And so for the systemic ones, many of the famous ones that you already know about, right? So for example, insulin, right? We know that it's made by the pancreas. Imagine here that that's insulin being made by some pancreatic cell. It goes into the bloodstream. It finds a target cell far away and gets that target cell to grab the sugar from the bloodstream, right? It's in order to regulate your blood sugar levels. We've got human growth hormone, right, which causes growth in different tissues throughout the body. We've got hormones like oxytocin, right? And we remember from ANP1, one of the first examples we did was childbirth. So we can imagine that this cell that's making it is the hypothalamus, the pituitary secretes it, and then the target cell is far away in the uterus of the mother who is doing contractions, and those contractions will get the birthing process going. So these are your basic classes of different hormones. So just to recap, we've got the paracrines, prostaglandin being the example. And so, for example, here we have an injury to a cell. That cell makes the prostaglandin. It tells a neighboring cell to mount some sort of inflammatory response. The autocrines are cells that stimulate themselves. For example, interleukins. T cells are leukocytes. So if you have to remember why we call it interleukin, leukocyte, right? Interleukin. In fact, communication between leukocytes, that's where this name comes from, where T cells have to mount an immune response. If this is the T cell that realizes there's a problem, it can then release an interleukin that stimulates itself to further activate and to make a bigger immune response. And then the third type are the systemic, for example, insulin, human growth hormone, oxytocin. We're going to see many more of these coming up. And so in this case, we want to think always definitely about the bloodstream, right? Where we have a hormone that's secreted out. It finds the bloodstream, it travels, right? The distance of the travel will depend, but it can travel far away and find a target cell far away where it can cause a change in that target cell far, far away from the original location of that secretion. The next topic that we want to go over is the class of hormones that we have. And we have two basic classes of hormones. So these are the hormones themselves. So whereas before we saw basically if they secrete, how far away they go, and what the target cell is, in this case we really want to look at the chemistry of the hormones or the chemicals themselves, and what implications that has for the target cells. So we've got two classes of hormones. We've got water-soluble hormones, and this just means that they dissolve in water easily. And we have lipid-soluble hormones, and this just means that they dissolve in oils easily. Now, when you think about the bloodstream, right? This is a blood vessel here with blood. Well, blood has a lot of water in it, right? And so that water inside the blood will affect whether that water-soluble hormone dissolves inside the bloodstream or not. And so what I want to point out first here is that in this case, these three green dots are three water-soluble hormones that I have, and they are just simply dissolved inside the bloodstream, and they can just flow through that bloodstream without any help because they're dissolved inside that blood, which is watery, right? But over here on the right side, where the lipid-soluble hormone is being depicted, this is the lipid-soluble hormone, and it actually cannot stay by itself like this, right? So this hormone right here actually needs some help, which is depicted as a hexagon in this case, instead of a dot. So dots for the water-soluble hormones and this hexagon for the lipid-soluble hormones. So what I have here is this, if you can see it here, this is a blue protein that is covering that green lipid-soluble hormone. And so basically it is a protein that helps it to dissolve inside the bloodstream, because if not, it would not dissolve. So it will not be by itself this way. It would have this blue protein covering it, and this blue protein would be the transport protein, right, that is written here. The transport protein, it works like a shuttle to shuttle that hormone from one location to the other. Once it gets close to the target cell, which is down here, that blue transport protein opens up and allows for that hormone to then detach so it can then travel down towards that target cell. So before we continue with this drawing, I just want to show what the textbook image looks like for this, and that will help us make sense of our drawing. And so here is a classic textbook image of this. This is the water-soluble hormone, and I'm going to try to make the picture a little simpler than all this to help you with memorizing this information. But what you see here is that water-soluble hormone comes out of that circulation of that, right here, that circulation, that blood vessel. It comes out and it travels down to find a receptor, which is this red square right there. It binds to the receptor, and then that receptor activates a series of changes on the inside of the cell. Let's just make a note of a few of these terms. We've got a G protein, which is this blue thing, coupled to the receptor, so it's touching the receptor. We have another protein in green here called adenylate cyclase. These are terms that we're going to see again on our drawing. We've got ATP, which everyone should know, and we have an arrow showing us that it's going to get changed into a molecule that loses two of the phosphates, because triphosphate, so 3 phosphates, to cyclic AMP, monophosphate. And then a series of what they call protein kinases. Now, kinase is the biological term that we use for phosphorylation. So these are proteins that phosphorylate. In fact, you can see it here, phosphorylate cellular proteins. And there's some other stuff here, but that's the main thing I want to point out in this picture. And then when we look at the lipid-soluble hormone diagram, we want to see that in this case we have that transport protein in blue, shuttling that hormone in green. We have the detachment there of the transport protein and the hormone. The hormone is able to now come out of circulation and find the target cell. One thing we want to pay attention to is the difference in how it goes to the target cell. So whereas this lipid-soluble hormone can just go right on through that cell membrane right there. You see that arrow going straight through? In this case, with the water-soluble protein, we did not have that. So this water-soluble hormone actually never ever goes inside, and it stays on the outside bound to the receptor. So moving back up here, what we have is that the receptor for the lipid-soluble hormone is now found inside the cell, and that's depicted by this red shape right here. And you can see the green hormone is binding to that red receptor inside the cell, and it can either be in the cytoplasm or it can be inside the nucleus itself. And then what we have here is the DNA that gets activated to make new proteins. So let's use that intro to try to draw it out ourselves. So I'm going to start with the water-soluble hormone. And what we want to do here is we want to first look at the G protein receptor. And some textbooks have it as this wavy shape because that's actually more accurate in terms of what it looks like. It kind of weaves in and out of that cell membrane that you have, right? Now, if this is a water-soluble hormone, right, these green dots, if they are water-soluble hormones, that means they dissolve in water or in blood, but don't forget that the cell membrane is actually a phospholipid bilayer, which means it's a fatty layer. And so whereas these hormones do just fine inside the blood, they cannot cross the phospholipid bilayer. And that is why they actually stay outside, and that is why the receptor is on the outside. Okay, so what we want to do is now draw that hormone that will start to dissolve out of the blood and make its way towards that binding site on the receptor. So there it is, and it eventually finds the receptor itself. So it binds to that receptor, and what's going to happen is that this receptor is going to then change, right, its conformation on the inside. And it's got this alpha subunit, which activates when a GTP molecule binds to it. And if you remember, GTP is similar to ATP, but ATP is the more famous version of energy currency within cells. So now you imagine a GTP binding to it once that hormone attaches to the receptor site. And in fact, let's realize that that is why it's called a G protein, is because of that GTP right there. That's why we call it that, okay? The next thing that happens is that this alpha subunit is going to detach from this location. It's going to break off, and it's going to start to float towards another protein in the chain of events called adenylate cyclase. So the alpha subunit basically detaches from here, starts to move this way, and runs into adenylate cyclase. And this is going to cause adenylate cyclase to activate. And once adenylate cyclase activates, what it does is it takes ATP in this case, and we all should know what ATP is, and converts it into a second messenger called cyclic AMP. And remember that ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate, so cyclic AMP stands for cyclic, which just means it has a circular shape to the chemistry of it, right? So don't worry too much about that cyclic. It has a circular shape to it. And that cyclic AMP is a monophosphate. So we've lost two phosphates off of that. What happens next is that the cyclic AMP causes a cascade of phosphorylations. Right? Phosphorylations of proteins within the target cell. And again, I told you I would simplify it from the previous textbook image. So instead of going through more details of it, this will be good enough for us. Phosphorylation of proteins is going to cause a change within this cell. And eventually, this phosphorylation of proteins will eventually, right, find its way to cause a change in the cell using, of course, the target being the DNA found inside the nucleus. Right? And what are we going to do here? We're going to do transcription to an mRNA molecule. The mRNA will exit the nucleus, right? Find a ribosome. And then that ribosome can make a new protein for us. Right? There's that new protein. And just to be clear what this means, and these terms that we should all be familiar with, from DNA to mRNA, we call it transcription. And from mRNA to protein, we call this step translation. Right? And just labeling this real quick, we've got the DNA, we've got the mRNA, right? We've got the mRNA here on the ribosome, and this bubble, these bubbles there that are all connected, those are amino acids on the chain. That right there is the protein. Right? And that's how we get a change. And that's one example of making a change. There's many different ways we could have made this change, but that's one way of understanding it. So what are some famous hormones that use this mechanism? After all, they are water soluble. We have epinephrine, which we're familiar with, norepinephrine, melatonin, everyone knows that's the sleep hormone. Histamine for inflammation. Serotonin has many effects, affects the brain as well. Insulin for blood sugar levels. Glucagon as the opposite of insulin. Parathyroid hormone and calcitonin, which we studied when we studied bone physiology. And these are some famous ones. There's many more. And then from the pituitary gland, we have all of these that come out of the pituitary. All pituitary hormones are going to be water soluble. And from the hypothalamus, these are the hypothalamic releasing hormones, which we're going to see in a second, how they all work. But you can just make a note of this. All the hypothalamic hormones are also water soluble. So a big list of water-soluble hormones, right? And if you want to imagine, well, what's happening here? So, for example, if this is histamine that's coming in and attaching to that G protein coupled receptor, the eventual change here would be inflammation, right? That's what we would get after all is said and done. All these are the details, but at the end of the day, at least try to understand that inflammation would be the result. If this were insulin, right, then of course, right, we'd have a cascade of events, but at the end of the day, it would be for this cell to absorb sugar, right, from the bloodstream. If it were for norepinephrine, right, if this were norepinephrine or epinephrine, right, the result would be, for example, that this cell would help with the fight or flight response of the individual after all is said and done. So you do have to know these details as an example of what happens, and there are different versions of this. I do want to point that out. There are many different versions of this, but this is the one that I'm choosing to have you memorize. So even though it looks like a lot, it is quite simplified compared to if you had to learn the whole spectrum of the result of this water-soluble hormone to the G protein interaction. So now let's shift gears and look at how lipid-soluble hormones behave. So here we have the lipid-soluble hormone. Once again, we want to remember that because it's lipid-soluble, it has that transport protein. That transport protein opens up, releases that hormone, and that hormone is now available to diffuse. So once it does diffuse, right, it's going to come out of circulation. There it is. Now it did have a limitation within the bloodstream that it could not float on its own without that help of that transport protein. However, it does have an advantage with the target cell because the target cell, again, that cell membrane is a phospholipid bilayer, right? So whereas the water-soluble hormone could not actually enter that cell because it was water-soluble, it would basically bounce off that phospholipid bilayer. That is not the case with the lipid-soluble hormone. The lipid-soluble hormone, because it's lipid-soluble, because it can dissolve with fats, right? And the phospholipid bilayer is a lipid bilayer after all, so it can dissolve within it. It will. And it will go ahead and just diffuse right on through that phospholipid bilayer and find itself inside the target cell. And now we still need a receptor, but in this case the receptor will be within the cell. And so let's draw it here. Here is the receptor. And there are two possible locations for it. We can either have it in the cytoplasm, or some receptors are found within the nucleus itself, right? So we can imagine these two possible scenarios. Either the hormone binds out here, right? And then eventually flows into that nucleus and does affect it by flowing into the nucleus and finding that double-stranded DNA, right, to target transcription and translation. Or this hormone can actually do a second possible thing, which is to flow into the nucleus itself. The receptor is inside the nucleus in this case, and it binds within the nucleus. Regardless, the overall effect is the same, that the DNA is targeted, right? We're going to target that DNA. And we're going to do a very similar thing that we did with the water-soluble hormones, which is, right, we are going to make a single-stranded mRNA. That's known as transcription, the mRNA that can then exit the nucleus, right? It can find a ribosome, okay? And that ribosome can then manufacture a protein for us. Amino acids on a chain, right? That's all a protein is. Amino acids on a chain that then end up folding onto each other and making the eventual protein for us. So again, right, we have, just to label this, that's the mRNA, this is the protein in this case. We still have simply transcription and translation. And so eventually that protein would be the change, right? And we'd get a change in the target cell as a result. Let's look at the list of hormones that can do it this way. The list is much smaller. That's one thing to notice here, right? So look at the list of water-soluble hormones, which, by the way, this is an incomplete list. We could make it much longer than this. For lipid-soluble hormones, again, this list is incomplete, but not by that much. the list of hormones is much smaller. So we've got aldosterone, which is made by the adrenal medulla. I'm sorry, the adrenal cortex. Okay, my apologies. The adrenal cortex. We've got cortisol, which is also made by the adrenal cortex. We've got testosterone, made by testes. We've got estrogen and progesterone, made by ovaries. T3 and T4, this is your thyroid hormone, made by your thyroid gland. Nitric oxide, NO for nitric oxide, a gas made by endothelial cells in your blood vessels for vasodilation. Vasodilation. Okay, so my suggestion to you would be to try to memorize this list first. And that way you know that these are the lipid-soluble hormones, because if you've memorized this, it's easier to then remember that all the rest are water-soluble. Right? That's just my way of thinking about it to help me remember these things. Okay, so another thing that can help a little bit is to realize that all three of these hormones are sex hormones, right? We know that testosterone, made by testes, right, that target cell, these proteins, would end up developing those cells to a more male development, right? Whereas estrogen and progesterone would develop towards a more female development in the target cell. So that takes care of those three. And then for cortisol and aldosterone, these are both made by the adrenal cortex. So that's kind of easy to remember to pair these two together, right? And then you can kind of take these two separately and just say, okay, thyroid hormone, T3, T4, and nitric oxide. Nitric oxide is a gas. And so it's a little different than how these other hormones are made. But the reason why it is classified as a lipid-soluble hormone is because gases diffuse right through that phospholipid bilayer. And so we don't need a receptor on the outside to receive it. No, nitric oxide just goes right on through, and therefore it's classified as a lipid-soluble hormone. The last segment of this lecture is going to go over the hypothalamus and the hypophysis, or otherwise known as the pituitary gland, right? And their interactions in order to make hormones. So I'm using here Frank Netter's Atlas of Anatomy because it has some of the best drawings for this. And I just want to orient everyone to this part of the brain here. We have the thalamus up here, right? This is the interthalamic adhesion, and that's connecting the thalamus on one side to the other side. And then under the thalamus, you can see this letter W here, right? That letter W, that is the boundary of what is known as the hypothalamus, which is all of this area in here and is being depicted by these different colored nuclei. And when we say nucleus in neuroscience, we mean clusters of cell bodies. Then underneath that, what you'll see is a stalk, right? A little skinny stalk known as an infundibulum, right? This is known as the pituitary stalk as well. And then hanging down from that infundibulum, you have the hypophysis, otherwise known as the pituitary gland. And there are two parts to this pituitary gland. There is the anterior pituitary, also known as the adenohypophysis, and the posterior pituitary, also known as the neurohypophysis. So the important thing to realize is that a lot of hormones are being made up here inside the hypothalamus, and that's why these clusters of neurons are being depicted. We don't have to memorize all their names. It's good to look at some of them and to realize that they do have names. For example, the paraventricular nucleus is this one in blue. The supraoptic nucleus is this one in green. And the arcuate nucleus is this one over here in purple. These are just some of the ones that show up more often. It's just it's a good idea to learn some of them, at least to know that they're there, right? And each one of these nuclei will be famous for making a certain hormone or a few different types of hormones. Now, if we shift down this page to look at the bottom half of this page, we're going to see that they've removed some of those nuclei, but what they have here that's interesting, which is nice, is they have the neuron cell bodies there that are a bit larger, right? And then traveling down are these wires that are the axons. So that's kind of cool, right? So they're showing you, look, those are the cell bodies and these are the axons. And why this is important is because you can see that the axons are actually only going to the neurohypophysis, otherwise known as the posterior pituitary gland, whereas they are not traveling or connecting to the adenohypophysis, otherwise known as the anterior pituitary gland. And that's really important because what we're going to find out is that the posterior pituitary gland does not make hormones. Instead, what it does is it receives hormones being made up here in the hypothalamus. Those hormones travel down the axons and get secreted out through synaptic end bulbs in the posterior pituitary gland, and then the posterior pituitary gland releases them into the bloodstream. We will find out that, on the other hand, the anterior pituitary gland does manufacture its own hormones as a result of hormones from the hypothalamus that instead have to travel not via axons, but instead via the bloodstream to get to the anterior pituitary gland. Let's see a picture of that so that you can understand what that is all like. So here is the picture that shows the blood supply, and this is really fascinating, right? So here they've removed the nuclei that were labeled above. So you've got the hypothalamus above. All right, that's all of this is the hypothalamus, but they're not showing you the nuclei anymore, right? So you just have to know that they're there. And then all of this, look at this. That's the blood supply. Okay, so let's take a look at this, right? First of all, you've got this hypophyseal artery that comes in. So this artery is bringing blood to this area, right? And then this blood, notice it's turning blue here as it's going through these capillary beds right here, right? So in capillary beds, the blood always goes from red, right? From red, because it's oxygenated, but then once it gives that oxygen to these capillary beds, it goes to blue. And so basically you can imagine this oxygen exchange happening at every single branch here, right? Also on this side, every single branch here, that's happening throughout these capillary beds. And then what we see here that's very interesting is that we've got these two very large blue veins. And notice what they're labeled as. It says long hypophyseal portal vein, which is this one. And then this one right here is known as the shorts, right? The short hypophyseal. The last segment of this lecture is going to go over the hypothalamus, and the hypophysis, or otherwise known as the pituitary gland, right? And their interactions in order to make hormones. So I'm using here Frank Netter's Atlas of Anatomy because it has some of the best drawings for this. And I just want to orient everyone to this part of the brain here. We have the thalamus up here, right? This is the interthalamic adhesion, and that's connecting the thalamus on one side to the other side. And then under the thalamus, you can see this letter W here, right? That letter W, that is the boundary of what is known as the hypothalamus, which is all of this area in here and is being depicted by these different colored nuclei. And when we say nucleus in neuroscience, we mean clusters of cell bodies. Then underneath that, what you'll see is a stalk, right? A little skinny stalk known as an infundibulum, right? This is known as the pituitary stalk as well. And then hanging down from that infundibulum, you have the hypophysis, otherwise known as the pituitary gland. And there are two parts to this pituitary gland. There is the anterior pituitary, also known as the adenohypophysis, and the posterior pituitary, also known as the neurohypophysis. So the important thing to realize is that a lot of hormones are being made up here inside the hypothalamus, and that's why these clusters of neurons are being depicted. We don't have to memorize all their names. It's good to look at some of them and to realize that they do have names. For example, the paraventricular nucleus is this one in blue. The supraoptic nucleus is this one in green. And the arcuate nucleus is this one over here in purple. These are just some of the ones that show up more often. It's just it's a good idea to learn some of them, at least to know that they're there, right? And each one of these nuclei will be famous for making a certain hormone or a few different types of hormones. Now, if we shift down this page to look at the bottom half of this page, we're going to see that they've removed some of those nuclei, but what they have here that's interesting, which is nice, is they have the neuron cell bodies there that are a bit larger, right? And then traveling down are these wires that are the axons. So that's kind of cool, right? So they're showing you, look, those are the cell bodies and these are the axons. And why this is important is because you can see that the axons are actually only going to the neurohypophysis, otherwise known as the posterior pituitary gland, whereas they are not traveling or connecting to the adenohypophysis, otherwise known as the anterior pituitary gland. And that's really important because what we're going to find out is that the posterior pituitary gland does not make hormones. Instead, what it does is it receives hormones being made up here in the hypothalamus. Those hormones travel down the axons and get secreted out through synaptic end bulbs in the posterior pituitary gland, and then the posterior pituitary gland releases them into the bloodstream. We will find out that, on the other hand, the anterior pituitary gland does manufacture its own hormones as a result of hormones from the hypothalamus that instead have to travel not via axons, but instead via the bloodstream to get to the anterior pituitary gland. Let's see a picture of that so that you can understand what that is all like. So here is the picture that shows the blood supply, and this is really fascinating, right? So here they've removed the nuclei, that were labeled above. So you've got the hypothalamus above. All right, that's all of this is the hypothalamus, but they're not showing you the nuclei anymore, right? So you just have to know that they're there. And then all of this, look at this, that's the blood supply. Okay, so let's take a look at this, right? First of all, you've got this hypophyseal artery that comes in. So this artery is bringing blood to this area, right? And then this blood, notice it's turning blue here as it's going through these capillary beds right here, right? So in capillary beds, the blood always goes from red, right? From red, because it's oxygenated, but then once it gives that oxygen to these capillary beds, it goes to blue. And so basically you can imagine this oxygen exchange happening at every single branch here, right? Also on this side, every single branch here, that's happening throughout these capillary beds. And then what we see here that's very interesting is that we've got these two very large blue veins. So now what I want to do is I want to use the drawings that I have made to go over the physiology and to compare and contrast the physiology of the anterior and the posterior pituitary glands. One thing I'm gonna note here is that in my drawings, it's reversed as to which one is anterior and which one's posterior. So I've got the posterior here on the left side of the drawing, the anterior on the right side. And same thing over here. Posterior on the left side, anterior on the right side. And just to remind you that if you look back at the Netter anatomy textbook, it was reversed with the anterior on the left and the posterior on the right. And you'll see that happening in textbooks where one textbook has it one way, the other textbook has it the other way. So it's fine to get used to that. So let's first go over the physiology of the anterior pituitary gland. We start with the idea that, again, we've got that hypothalamus that's sitting above, right? All of this is that hypothalamus above here. You've got the infundibulum. You've got the posterior pituitary, which we'll see in a little bit. And you've got the anterior pituitary, which we're going over right now. So the hormones, and this is not 100% complete. There are a couple of others that are not going to be included in this lecture, but these are the ones that you're responsible for. The ones that we're going to go over are growth hormone releasing hormone. So that's our first one, which is also called GHRH. Thyrotropin releasing hormone, also known as TRH. And you do have to memorize both of these, right? You have to memorize the long form and the short form because you'll see both of them being used. Gonadotropin releasing hormone, or GnRH. And corticotropin releasing hormone, or CRH. So the idea here is that, again, we are going to use those portal veins, which are these two right here, to transport these hormones down to the anterior pituitary, which is going to make its own hormones as a result. So before we get there, let's see what is similar here in these names. All of them have this word inside of them, releasing hormones, right? So anytime you see that word releasing in the name, you know that it has to be hypothalamic and that it has to go through these portal veins to target cells in the anterior pituitary in order to get the anterior pituitary to make other hormones. So please keep that in mind. All of these releasing hormones are simply going from the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary, right? They're not going far out throughout the body, right? It's a short distance to go from the hypothalamus to the pituitary. In fact, the hypothalamus is famous for controlling the pituitary gland, right? The pituitary gland is nicknamed the master endocrine gland, but in all honesty, it is always listening to what the hypothalamus is telling it to do. So then what hormones does the anterior pituitary make? It makes human growth hormone, also known as HGH, right? Little h is usually the first H is a little h, then capital GH for human growth hormone. Thyroid stimulating hormone, TSH. Follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Usually these are paired together because they kind of secrete together and they go toward to the same organ, specifically the reproductive organs. And that's FSH and LH down here. And adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH. So again, you do have to memorize both the full word as well as the short form because you will see both. So the way to do this is once you get these basic names down and the drawing down, you want to know what is stimulating what. So if you start with GHRH, or growth hormone releasing hormone, you want to imagine it, right? Moving down this portal vein, right? Traveling through that portal system until it finds a part of the pituitary that can make HGH, and that's going to be its target, and then the pituitary would make HGH as a result of being told to make it by that GHRH. So without the GHRH, the pituitary would never make HGH. Now for TRH, or thyrotropin releasing hormone, right, you want to imagine it moving down, right? And similarly, it needs to find a part of the pituitary that can make TSH, otherwise known as thyroid stimulating hormone. So again, the pituitary is not going to make TSH unless the hypothalamus has made TRH and sent it down those portal veins. For gonadotropin releasing hormone, this one is going to travel down and actually it will cause the pituitary, right, to make both FSH and LH, and that's why they're commonly paired together as well. They're both under the control of GnRH. And corticotropin releasing hormone travels down, right, and finds a part of the pituitary that can make adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH. And so that's the first part to memorize, is to understand which hormones up here are causing the production of the hormones down there. The next thing to do is to realize that these hormones are now going to go systemic, meaning that they're now going to come out of that pituitary through a vein, right? And they are going to have to find their own target cells and organs. And so where are these hormones going to end up going? So let's go one by one here. So we start with the first one that we did, right? We have growth hormone releasing hormone gives us human growth hormone. Human growth hormone goes systemic, right? Goes to the body and finds muscle tissue, adipose tissue as its target, right? Increases muscle mass. We know that about human growth hormone. It increases lipolysis. In other words, less fat is going to be stored if you're making a lot of human growth hormone. It also targets the liver, and the liver makes its own hormone known as insulin-like growth factor. Right? Also known as IGF, which is going to target bone tissue, making bones bigger. Right? So we know that there's a certain gigantism, for example, right? Gigantism, or acromegaly even, and we've learned about that in previous chapters when it came to bone tissue, which can affect, right, the size of bone. And that's how it works, right? It could be because you either could have an overproduction of GHRH as the original cause in the hypothalamus, or maybe a tumor in the in the pituitary that could be manufacturing too much HGH. Regardless, right? If you have very high levels of these hormones, right, you're going to grow larger than average. And we can see how that would work. The second example, we have thyrotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus going to the pituitary. The pituitary makes and secretes thyroid stimulating hormone, and then thyroid stimulating hormone has to go systemic. Where does it go? It goes to the thyroid gland. And we know that the thyroid gland makes T3, T4, otherwise known as thyroid hormone. And the result of this thyroid hormone is that it goes to other body cells to increase their metabolism, right? You get an increase in metabolism when you have an increase of T3, T4. Gonadotropin releasing hormone, right? Think about the word gonad, gonadotropin, right? It's telling you something based on that name. So gonadotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus gives us LH and FSH from the pituitary gland. And this LH and FSH goes systemic. Where does it go? It goes to testes and ovaries, right? In the male, we get sperm production. We also get testes stimulated to make testosterone, which gives more of a male characteristic to the human. In the female, the target for the LH and the FSH is the egg. We also have the female cycle, right, as a result. And we also get increase in estrogen, which gives female characteristics. And the last one on the list, we've got corticotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. And from the pituitary, we get adrenocorticotropic hormone. Where does this go once it goes systemic, right? It's going to go to the adrenal cortex. And in the adrenal cortex, we're going to get aldosterone, right? Aldosterone works on salt levels inside the blood for blood pressure and for fluid levels. It also works on cortisol, which works on sugar levels and is also a stress hormone. And finally, we have androgens, which are being made by the adrenal cortex. Androgens, the word andros means male. Testosterone is an example of the most famous androgen, but there are other types, other versions of it, and those are coming out of the adrenal cortex. So now what we want to do is understand then how the posterior pituitary is working. And this is going to be a little cleaner, a little easier to follow. Remember that you do have those nuclei in that hypothalamus up there. And here are the cell bodies at the top, right? That's what is going on in that hypothalamus. You've got these clusters of somas, cell bodies, that are making certain types of hormones. And then those hormones are either secreted in the hypothalamus itself to then go into the portal system, or in this case, for the posterior pituitary gland, we're going to use the axons to travel. Here I've highlighted just 2 of the nuclei, right? You do not have to memorize all of them, but it's good to know some of these. Paraventricular nucleus and supraoptic nucleus as 2 of the famous ones where hormones are being made. And again, we're not going to use the bloodstream, so we're going to be making them in these cell bodies. We're going to transport them via axons all the way down to the synaptic end bulbs down here, right? And at those synaptic end bulbs down here, that's where they're going to be secreted. And which only two hormones do we have to know for the posterior pituitary gland, right? Vasopressin, which is also nicknamed antidiuretic hormone, or ADH. So this has actually 2 names associated with it. Please memorize both, because both are used. The reason why we use the word vasopressin is because it is a vasoconstrictor. So think about blood vessels, vasopressing on your blood, constricting on your blood. And then the other name that we use for it is antidiuretic hormone, ADH, because it basically stops you from urinating in times of dehydration. So here are the functions of vasopressin / antidiuretic hormone. Conserves H2O during urine formation, right? Less urine is made, therefore you're holding on to that water because you're dehydrated. You do not want to pee it out. And this contraction of arteriolar smooth muscle, vasopressor, okay? Those are the 2 functions of that hormone. The other one you're already familiar with, very likely, because in A&P1 you learned about childbirth for positive feedback loops. So that second hormone is known as oxytocin. And so here you have contraction of uterine smooth muscle for childbirth. Let's not forget that as oxytocin levels rise and childbirth happens, that same oxytocin is going to be important for the ejection of milk from the mammary glands, which is also a positive feedback loop. More suckling equals more oxytocin, right? That's being made up here in the hypothalamus, brought down here to the posterior pituitary, right? And then it goes into the bloodstream to eventually target the mammary glands, right? All the way to the mammary glands. And that's going to cause more ejection of milk, more production of milk with prolactin. And the third one that's very interesting is maternal behavior. In other words, you have that mom-child bonding that takes place due to the production of oxytocin. So 3 things happening with that childbirth. Childbirth is, of course, the first. Mammary glands is the second. And maternal behavior for parent-child bonding is the third.